So we've spent the last decade obsessed with being perfect. We've scrubbed every typo from our website, sanitized every case study, polished our brands until they're as smooth and reflective as a glass office building in a gentrified tech hub. Yeah, we did it to look professional. We did it to look competent. And here's the problem. In 2026, competence, professional, that's a commodity. AI can do perfect in 4 seconds for the price of one of your LLM credits. So if your brand is flawless, you probably aren't being perceived as professional as much as you're being perceived as synthetic. And here's the big question. If your customers can't find a single crack in your story, why on earth would they trust you? Yeah, let's talk about that. So this is part 3 of our series on winning trust in the age of synthetic noise. And in the last 2 sessions, I've showed how we've hit that beige wall with our content. It's that suffocating layer of AI-generated adequacy, And then last week, in part 2, what we did was we introduced the plural brand, the antidote to this, moving room to room, community to community with different stories tailored to add value to those rooms, to those communities. But today, we're going to go into the room itself because talking about the message itself is important. Because once you've stopped shouting at some phantom market and started talking to real communities, real people, we have a choice. We can keep reading from the same perfect script, the polished one that everybody else is using, or we can do something radical, distinct, different. We can stop trying to be the hero and start being, real. Today, we're going to talk about what we might call the Pratfall protocol in B2B branding. And yeah, I know that sounds a little bit like a Big Bang episode title, but let's talk about that, B2B storytelling. So we'll start with the hero's journey, right? The hero's journey is now in B2B a cul-de-sac. I mean, let's be honest. We've spent 15 years kneeling at the altar of storytelling. And I'll raise my hand, by the way. I was one of the head priests of that church. We forced every bored B2B buyer into a hero's journey costume that they didn't really ask for. We told them that we were Luke Skywalker and we were Yoda, and then we humanized those brands, our brands, right? We humanized them by posting photos of office dogs and foosball tables, and we humanized it with the fun room. The industrial ball bearings and software as a service widgets became game night, free lunches, all of those things in order to humanize our brand story. It was forced whimsy. It was industrial grade storytelling. And you know the formula with the case study, for example. Status quo sucks. Then our brand shows up like Deus Ex Machina and everything is optimized. 300%, unicorns and rainbows, ROI, boom, end of story. All right, yeah, I'm being a little cynical, of course. Trust me, I know that. Storytelling is important, and storytelling structure is important. And in 2015, it worked brilliantly because we weren't structured in those days. In 2026, it can be just more beige noise because guess what? AI got the memo and trained on our perfectly structured B2B storytelling, and it has now gentrified the hero's journey. Ask any LLM to write a case study, and it'll give you the exact arc I just mentioned. Perfectly structured and perfectly boring. When structure is everywhere, it becomes invisible. And that brings us to the trust paradox. So what is the trust paradox? Well, AI is now so good at sounding confident that we humans have stopped checking for facts. The syntax is now so perfect that we can't tell if it is true or it just sounds true. And the paradox is that for us humans, that difference is often not that important. In other words, the paradox is if it sounds true, we often just think that it is true. So as a result, our brand is no longer being judged on being correct. It's judged on being distinct. If you write a perfectly polished, error-free white paper, even if it is 100% human created, a good half of your audience's brains may flag it as being synthetic. And vice versa, of course. The point is, you're now guilty of being a bot until you prove human. The only way to perhaps demonstrate that you're not leaving it up to AI or automation is leave some of those rough edges in. You need friction. So enter what we might call the Pratfall protocol. Now, this idea is based on the Pratfall effect, which is a well-known scientific body of research that shows if people think you're competent, that actually they like you more when you screw up. The flaw humanizes the competence. Think about your messaging for a second. The monolith brand approach that I talked about a couple of weeks ago, it says your brand might come into a room and say, our AI software onboarding is frictionless and zero downtime. It's just magic. Now, the Pratfall approach, the one that you use, by the way, specifically in the technical developer Discord chat room, says, look, the first week of our AI software implementation is going to be an absolute train wreck. It's messy. It'll probably break twice and you'll hate us on day 3. But on day 4, you're going to see data and insight that you've never seen before. Now, that's not the same message you use, by the way, in the boardroom pitch with the CFO, because, of course, they might have a heart attack if they heard that. But the data engineer, well, they just fell in love with your brand. Why? Because they know implementation and migration of software is hard. When you pretend it's easy, you look like a marketer. You look like a liar. And when you admit that it's a nightmare, you're the only vendor they're going to trust. So what you're doing in that world is basically affecting something called a costly signal. Now, that's a term you probably haven't heard since university biology. The costly signal is, well, for example, a fiddler crab with a giant useless claw that makes it vulnerable to predators. It's a costly signal that says, I'm so strong, I can survive this handicap. In B2B, a pratfall approach is a costly signal. When you admit your implementation is painful, you are risking a transactional relationship in order to earn a trustworthy one. You see, ultimately, the smooth brain of an AI can simulate those words. They can simulate the words of a mistake, but they can't be real about it. They have no reputation to lose. There is no ego for them to bruise. Humans are built to sniff out the difference between someone risking their neck and someone reading a generated script. Trust comes from the risk, not from the flaw. So, how do we operationalize all this, right? Well, the first thing we can think about is stop writing our success stories and start writing conflict stories. In other words, move away from the smooth arc of the monolith. Stop saying things like, well, here's how company X won with our solution. Nobody cares about that. Start by saying, why company X almost fired us in month 2. Now that headline creates a hitch in the professional matrix, right? It forces our brains to go, let's stop scanning for a second and start processing. It signals reality, honesty. It shows you have the confidence, the core brand, to admit things went wrong because you know the struggle validates the eventual win, the success. We've spent a decade trying to make everything frictionless and easy and magic. And here is the economic truth of 2026. In an economy of infinite ease, value shifts to things that are perceived as being harder. Now, next week, we're going to dig into that shift. We're going to talk about how effort is becoming the new luxury and how you can balance that message to operationalize your plural brand. But for this week, do me a favor. Take a look at your content pillars. If they're looking a little too sturdy, the marble is perhaps a little too polished, knock one of them over. Until then, it's your story. F it up a little bit. That might be telling it a little better. I'll see you next week.